In this talk, I want to talk about documentation quality. And quality, what is it? Because this is something I think about a lot, and not just in the kind of ordinary run of things when I'm creating documentation or working with other people to create documentation, because in fact, the issue of documentation quality affects every area of my job, and probably yours as well. So one example is in hiring. I'm on Google's Tech Writing Hiring Committee, and I do a lot of interviewing. And that means I talk to a lot of really talented writers, and I review a lot of really great portfolios. And over the years, my interviewing style has changed, and my favorite interview question, it's actually really, really simple. After we've spent some time talking about projects and docs and work practices and all the normal interview questions, my favorite question is, so you've done these docs, how do you know if your docs are good? How do you know? And the answers are always revealing, depending on the caliber of the candidate and also the experience. The answers can touch on a huge number of things across the business. User data, usage data, time to hello world, support data, all of this. But one of the things I've noticed is this can sometimes be a difficult conversation to have, because we don't really have an established vocabulary for talking about and communicating doc quality. And I see it in other areas as well. That same question, are your docs any good? Comes up in other areas. We've just finished our performance review time at Google, thank goodness. And this is a time when I write my self-assessment and I link to all sorts of information, including docs I've written, and I also review my peers. And so my peers are looking at my self-assessment, they're following links to documentation, and they can see often that my documentation, it looks beautiful, it can be very nicely written, it can be nicely formatted, follows style guide and all of this. But it's very hard for my peers to tell if my documentation is actually any good, apart from being just pretty, and well-formed, but is it actually good? Is it actually effective? And because we lack that, what I believe is we need to establish a common vocabulary for documentation quality. We need a way to define what document quality is. We need a set of guidelines so that we can deliver to meet those definitions, and we need to be able to communicate the value and impact of the work that we do. And this can be pretty challenging because most of us as technical writers, the range of documentation that we produce is very large, and having a one-size-fits-all definition of document quality that fits end-user guides, admin docs, engineering docs, internal, external, can be very challenging. But that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about creating and using a vocabulary for talking about documentation quality and communicating its impact and its value. One thing I do want to say is that a lot of the content of this talk was actually developed by an amazing co-worker of mine, Aaron Gillis. He's kind of my partner in crime. Unfortunately, he can't be here today, but he is the brains behind much of this. And the fluff, you can blame me. So, let's go and talk about documentation quality. And what I want to propose is that when we look at documentation quality, there are really two aspects to it. There is structural quality and functional quality, and I want us to look at them both. Because it's very hard to determine. Without this common vocabulary, documentation quality is kind of like the judicial definition of pornography, which in the Supreme Court, I know it when I see it. This is a high quality. That is not enough. To be effective and to bring real value to our businesses and to be recognized and rewarded for the value and impact that we make, we need something more. Okay, we need to be able to understand documentation quality and define the requirements to enable us to reach that. We need to be able to execute on those requirements, measure our success, and communicate our value. So that's what I want to talk about. The language that I'm using here around structural quality and functional quality actually comes from the world of software testing, which by its nature is involved with quality and determining quality, and which over the last 10 years has gotten increasingly professionalized. The first type of quality that we talk about is structural quality. And this describes what the documentation should be like. And often it's the thing that we think about first when we look at documentation quality. It's the kind of quality that we as a profession reference when we refer to ourselves as wordsmiths or sentence architects or various other descriptions that I've seen of technical writing. Structural quality, like adherence to style guide, good writing and grammar, structural organization, good navigation, this is the easiest type of quality to detect and determine because spelling is correct or it isn't, style is followed or it isn't. So it's easy for us to determine, and because we can measure it, we report on it. But the problem is that structural quality in and of itself tells us nothing about how effective that documentation is. Structural quality is sometimes what I think of as pretty. It is very important, but it is not the ultimate source of our value, and it doesn't define our worth. And sometimes, because it's so easy to measure, we can almost overdo structural quality when we focus on it at the expense of other aspects of documentation. The second type of quality is functional quality. While structural quality describes what docs should be like, functional quality describes the effectiveness of the documentation. A document with high functional quality is one that does what it's supposed to do. It achieves what it was designed to do. It satisfies its status requirements, which are usually a business goal. For example, a document with high functional quality is one that helps grow adoption, or deflects support calls, or reduces onboarding time for new employees. So, we've talked about these terms, functional quality and structural quality. These are new, or relatively new to the field of technical documentation. So I wanted to come up with a way to communicate these and to clearly illustrate the difference between these types of quality. So I created a slideshow. And the purpose of this slideshow, its purpose is to effectively illustrate the two kinds of documentation quality. What we're going to do is watch this very, very brief slideshow, and then we're going to do a little quality analysis. You ready? Okay. Wow, let that sink in for a moment. That was pretty powerful, pretty emotional stuff. Let's just think about what we saw there. Okay, moving on. Let's analyze this. How do we do on structural quality? Well, I think when we look at this, we can see that we have beautiful images. There were a very selective and expressive selection of images. The timing was spot on. The editing was perfect. It was very emotionally powerful. I think we can say that the structural quality of this slideshow was very high. I am very satisfied with it. But how do we do on functional quality? Let's have a look at that. And I failed. I think the problem was, while this slideshow had excellent structural quality, it did not effectively illustrate our two types of documentation quality. It did not fulfill its purpose. So, what we learned from this is that you can have a piece of documentation that can have very high structural quality. It can be beautifully organized, it can reach all of these traditional things that we look at for technical documentation. But if it has low functional quality, your overall quality is going to be poor. It is not going to accomplish its task. Functional quality can often, and in fact usually, depends a lot on structural quality. I'm not saying that structural quality is not important, and depending on the purpose of the document, it may be extremely important. But it's here that sometimes if we focus too much on structural quality, on pretty, that can hurt us if it is a red herring that deflects us from what really matters. Functional quality may depend on structural quality, but functional quality is always the most important. Functional quality also has a much, much stronger relationship to what we perceive as value. When we communicate our work to people and to the business and to the projects that we support, pointing out the beautiful grammar and the beautifully crafted sentences and all these areas of structural quality, they're very nice, but without functional quality, it's very, very hard to determine our value. So if we want to deliver value, and if we want to get recognized and rewarded for the value that we deliver, and I think we do, functional quality should be our goal. So, in the next part of this talk, want to establish the two types of documentation quality, want to talk about structural quality is a means to an end. It's very important, but the end is functional quality. So how do we get there? Here's some tips that I want to bring forward for technical writers. What we need to do is to be able to understand documentation quality. And that means once we have that understanding, we need to be able to define the requirements. We need to execute on those requirements, measure success, and communicate value. So the starting place is always functional requirements. Traditionally, when we focus on structural quality, we might say something like, here's an API, and an API needs the following types of documentation. It needs an API reference and a developer guide and a getting started guide and a troubleshooting and an FAQ. Those are our requirements. But actually, when we start with functional requirements, when we state what this documentation is supposed to do or to achieve, rather than what the documentation is supposed to look like, we're on the road to providing value to our projects. So, how do you define these requirements? We define them. The people who get to define the requirements are our internal and external stakeholders. And internal stakeholders could be your other technical writers, your manager, could be the product team, very much so, and often it can be even at the company level. This is our company goal to increase adoption, reduce support calls, whatever that is. External stakeholders, these are generally our users. And we can understand users' pain points, we can gather feedback and do that, but the functional requirements should always be defined in context with internal and external stakeholders. So, examples of functional requirements. Grow adoption of a product or feature. Deflect support calls, that tends to be a big one. Increase signups, get the credit card number. Improve task completion. Onboard employees more quickly. You can have all sorts of functional requirements for your documentation. The important thing is to determine them. The next step is, now you have the requirements, what do? This is where I'm going to hand wave. This is where I say, you execute on them. You write the docs. And that is acknowledging the different types of functional requirements will always require different types of strategies or practices to meet them. And this kind of thing, talking about these strategies and practices, is beyond the scope of this talk. But it is also why we come to conferences like this. And it's why we talk to other tech writers and read industry blogs and do this to understand the best way to achieve these types of goals. But you have your requirements, you execute on them, and then the next thing is you measure your success. And to do this, you need to gather the right kind of quality data, because if you can't measure it, you won't know if you've achieved it. You cannot manage what you don't measure. So I want to look at the types of data that are available to us. And I want to emphasize that if we want to demonstrate value and impact, we should focus on functional quality data, data that proves that these documents fulfill their required purposes. So, the reason for this is that structural quality data, it's not persuasive of value. It doesn't demonstrate impact. If you use stats like this, it follows the style guide, it uses active voice, it uses the right templates. it doesn't really demonstrate any impact on the business. It can be very useful in other ways, perhaps when you're training a new writer who's learning about technical writing. These are very appropriate things. But for actually demonstrating impact or value for technical writing, it's not particularly persuasive. But you know what is persuasive is functional quality data. It is convincing. And functional quality data has a very different shape from structural data. It can be trickier to gather, but in general it falls into two buckets. And the first bucket is sentiment data. Sentiment data is when your stakeholders, this can be your product team, your management chain, your external users, they report that they are happy with your work. It means that you have fulfilled their requirements and that it is, they are happy with the documentation. And we can gather this kind of sentiment data in an awful lot of different ways, by polling our users, by feedback widgets, looking at groups, talking to people, reading articles, looking at support calls, all this kind of thing. But this indicates whether our core users, if we have met their requirements. And some of the issues around sentiment data is it may be challenged sometimes. For example, when we rolled out a new platform at Google, one of the things we were talking about is we have 500 users and we got a lot of feedback. That's just anecdotal. It doesn't mean anything. But it does mean something. It means those 500 users found that this platform satisfied their requirements and so chose to move to it. Stakeholders are reporting on whether their requirements were satisfied. The second kind of functional quality data is user behavior, because this really is the goal of most documentation, right? To change user behavior in a certain kind of way. It can be trickier to do, but it's very compelling. So for example, if your product team has a goal where they want to increase adoption or awareness of a feature, this is something you can possibly test. If people view your documents and try out the feature, you can actually measure how well you achieved that goal. You can actually demonstrate that you had impact on a business goal, and that's very compelling. And once you've gathered your quality data, the next part is to use that to communicate your impact and value. You can use it to make a very strong case. Because some of the most important conversations we have are about this. We have it with everybody that we interact with, writers, managers, peers, and all of this. Because when we are talking about impact, we're talking about the value of our output and the value of it as it forwards these business goals. And traditionally, we have often focused on weak structural kind of value, like I created 37 docs, or I made this many change lists, or I updated this. What this measures is activity, not impact. This is a very weak case when we are putting forward and trying to demonstrate our value and impact. It's much easier to use actual functional quality data to make a statement. For example, let's take a case where you can describe the problem. We had a requirement to get adoption up on this feature. You can describe the work you did. I made a proposal, I restructured pitched it to the team, and it was accepted. You can carry on. I restructured the documentation according to these requirements. You've described the problem and what you did. Now you can start showing supporting data to show your impact. Users who read the new documentation tried out the feature. In a follow-up study, here's where you roll in your sentiment data. The people said that they were happy with the feature and it was fulfilling their needs. This is all very compelling data that we can actually provide because it puts it in the context of driving forward the goals of your business, of your project, of your team in a way that everybody can understand, in a way that makes it very clear to the stakeholders for your documentation. So the call to action that I want to make for us as technical writers and documentarians within the engineering business is let's make an effort, let's understand the differences between structural and functional quality. And let's commit to pursuing functional quality first and acknowledging that structural quality, while very, very important, is the means to achieve this goal of functional quality. And we do this by starting off with functional requirements and follow up by executing on them. gather functional data to demonstrate what we delivered, and use this data to make a really compelling case to illustrate your value and your impact. And finally, let's make a move away from defining our role as structural quality only, from our output as beautifully written and designed docs. Our output and our goal is not docs. I consider my output and goal to be happy, productive engineers. Yours may differ. As we do so, and as we do this as writers, we're going to find ourselves better aligned with our teams and our goals. And when we're aligned, we're going to find that our work is easier, it's more rewarding, and it is better rewarded. It is better. We all win when this happens. And I have 30 seconds left according to this, so thank you very much. Go slay. I'm around, and Riona M at twitter.com. Thank you.